Porn, it's everywhere. No longer on the top shelf in the newsagent. We carry Babylon around in our back pockets. We live in Pornland, whether that's the honey birdette advertising pictures in your local shopping mall or the anonymity, affordability, and accessibility of Pornhub on your phone. The average age of a person's first interaction with porn is 13, but many children view it younger than that. A recent article in Christian newspaper Eternity magazine highlighted how deep the problem goes, especially in high schools in Australia. And now, belatedly, the secular media is starting to see that the sexual liberation of the last 60 years isn't all it's cracked up to be. Is there a way out of Pornland, Steve?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think one of the issues that the culture is struggling with is that consent is now the only common denominator in sexuality issues. But it's the lowest common denominator, though. And the bloke who wrote that article in Eternity magazine, Daniel, points out that no amount of consent classes in a boys' school can provide enough of a dopamine hit to counter what porn is actually doing to people. And the onflow of porn to how women are being sexualized, as you hear how those in Sydney and Melbourne at the moment, there's schools signing up by young women saying, please change something. And I think porn is central to that. So, Dave, porn apparently is not what it was in the 70s and the 80s when it was wrapped up top shelf in a magazine. What has changed?
Well, it's much easier to get. That's the first thing. I mean, I was a teenager, believe it or not, around that time, the 70s anyway. And of course, a lot of my mates and workmates on the farm and all that kind of stuff, they would talk about porn. Very much a boys thing then as well. But it was still quite difficult to get. You know, you could get it, but then you know, it's something physical. You had to hide it from your parents and all the rest of it. Now I'm aware, you know, this is maybe seem a strange thing. I was never actually into it at all. I found it degrading, and was it the J. Giles band Centerfold, you know, so for me, it wasn't that much of an issue, but I had friends who were addicted to it. But if they were addicted to it then, how much easier now? The drug can be delivered straight to your home whenever you want. And I think availability and ubiquity is the big difference. Porn's always been around. It was around in biblical times, but the availability now is just upped up.
And it's changing us, isn't it? Have a look at this video. It's not from a Christian perspective, but it gets to the nub of the addiction issue, why it's so there, that it's hardwiring the brain. It's a really interesting commentary on what is happening with the ubiquity of porn.
Hey, it's Dr. Trish Lee. I had an awesome question on how long does it take a brain to heal from chronically watching pornography? Awesome question, but of course the answers are generally loaded, but here we go. Okay, so the answer is that is different depending upon the specific person, but let me tell you some of the factors that matter. And let me tell you that transformation can happen pretty quickly for someone when they stop watching pornography. Okay, so the way that it works is it depends on how long you've been watching porn, how often, how intense, how much at any given sitting. So of course, the longer, the more frequent, and the longer in duration, all of those things are going to impact how hardwired in your brain is towards needing pornography. And the reason that you need it is to escape a pain that you have inside that you might be aware of or not aware of. And the porn acts as a pain reliever, like an opiate in your brain for you. And that is how you get to the point where you might be, where you're watching it frequently. You've been watching it for 20 years. Now you're watching it more and more per day and week. And it is getting more intense, and the level of the graphic nature or violence or into fetishes or things that cross your moral boundaries even. So that's how you know that it is becoming really hardwired in. And I'm here to tell you that I know that many men that it happens to don't totally get that that is happening within them and for them and to them. So that's why I'm here, because I really want to help people. Okay, so how does a transformation happen and how long can it take? Well, when you stop watching porn, it will be difficult unless you have some behavioral strategies in place that I can teach you to use that will, first of all, not make it as difficult for you. Secondly, will give you something to do and to replace that habit and to help you move forward. And if you do that, within a month, you can feel and start performing differently. Things will start changing in your brain pretty quickly, because if you're not hardwiring in that pattern, and especially if you're hardwiring in a new, better one, and you're starting to rewire your brain, you can start feeling different quickly. But it takes time to really trench that new neural pathway in and have it be there for the long run. Okay, so that's the long answer, but you can feel better quickly when you stop watching porn and you start putting some different behaviors in place. Okay, I hope that helps you out. And remember, control your brain or it'll control you.
So control your brain, it says, Trish Lee says in that video, or it will control you. What is she saying about the way the brain actually works?
I think our brain develops certain patterns. And I think she's almost saying what Jesus said, that it's what you put in is what will come out. And I mean, that's remarkably insightful. So we were talking about, young boys. I'm thinking about 10-year-olds. I think it was 40% of 10-year-olds in my home city of Dundee had seen extreme or violent porn. Now, here's the point about that. They can never unsee it. It's there. You've seen it. It's in your brain. And I think that's one of the major issues.
No, that sounds, it's pretty hard to think that you can't unsee it. And what Trish Lee actually says there, though, is interesting, that you can launder out the addiction, in the sense that you can change the neural pathways in your brain. Talk us through that. There's a Christian element to that, as well as about how we use our minds and renew our minds, isn't there? For anyone who's struggling with it.
I think there is. Thomas Chalmers in the 19th century, now a 19th century Scotsman is about 250 years ahead of everyone else. So Thomas Chalmers, he had this sermon called the expulsive power of a new affection. And he was basically saying what Jesus said about, casting out one demon, then 7 come to replace it. And he was saying, just saying no isn't sufficient. You've got to have a motivation and a reason. And I think with porn, actually, I mentioned earlier, for me, what was significant was just thinking, well, what if that was my sister or my mother or one of my best friends? I would hate that. And I think it was actually, for me, a positive thing to reject porn, because I was saying, no, I don't want to treat people like that. And I think our brains do work like that.
Yeah, they do. And it's and the other thing about it is, with the brain, you need something stronger to maintain the same addictive feeling of a drug. So you need a higher level of the drug. So there's a porn spiral, isn't there? That somehow it isn't just a centerfold these days, as the song says. It's men expecting that women want them to be treated violently. And how does it get there? That's the spiral.
Yeah, and it's a bit like drinking salt water if you're thirsty. So porn doesn't satisfy, and it's never harmless. It always feeds and often leads on to something else. So I do think we're right to be concerned about it.
Yeah, and there's the idea of a better vision for life that Thomas Chalmers talks about, the expulsive power of a new affection. There'll always be something on the throne of your life. So the flip side is, porn is bad, but we're saying there's a vision of human life and the way we treat humans that's positive, that you replace it with. Isn't that what we're saying? That there's something more.
Yeah, I think so. For example, one of the reactions that a lot of Christians might have will be to react against porn in such a way that it sounds as though we're saying sex is bad. But actually, we're saying that porn destroys sex. And there's evidence for that as well. What we're saying is that if you follow the Bible's pathway, if you like, or teaching, then better sex. I mean, we're not going to entitle the kitchen table that, but you'd probably get a lot of listeners if we did. But that really is it, though. There's so much truth in that.
Yeah, that's right. And so there's, on one hand, there was porn culture, and then the flip side of that was purity culture. But that didn't really pitch a vision of a, a life that looked somehow better, because it sort of put fences around these things and said, here's how far you can and can't go. It was kind of weird. Doesn't sound like a great vision for life in that sense.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't sound like a great vision for life. And I just think, if I can use the phrase wholesome, in the sense of the whole of life. So once you divorce, if you just make sex about a physical act and you divorce it from the rest of life, then you're certainly going to end up with porn, but you're also going to end up with dissatisfaction, and you're going to end up with perversity, and you're going to end up with abuse and all the other chickens that are coming home to roost just now.
Yeah. And so the idea of joy and pleasure, it somehow said that, the point of a religion or a Christian religion is to suppress desire. But I don't think that's what the Bible says about desire. It's about fulfillment of desire. You got anything from the Bible that would say anything about that?
Yes, Psalm 16, verse 11, at your right hand are pleasures evermore. Point is, God is the inventor of pleasure, not the devil. The devil is the perverter of it. But I'd also add what Paul says to Timothy, that God is the giver of all good things. So if we understand it in this way, that a perversion of any one of God's good gifts, including sex, because sex is a gift from God, it's how he's made us, but any perversion of that is actually leads to destruction, and destruction of the gift itself, as well as of so much else around that. And we're seeing that in our culture, aren't we?
Yes, we're seeing the trajectory that 60 years ago in the sexual revolution said this will be okay. Suddenly there's a sort of a back engineering to try and sort out a problem that's probably bolted before we can close the gate.
Indeed. Steve, I think we're going to go. We're not going to talk about sex next week. We did a 4-part series on politics, and I know you wanted to do a 4-part series on sex, but instead we're going to talk about your book. Is that not correct?
Oh yes, my humbly titled book, Being the Bad Guys. I was going to put a picture of you in the front, but decided against it.
Well, you're the expert, so I'm sure it will be an enlightening and stimulating conversation for those of us who are not quite the bad guys.
See you, Dave.
See you next week.